And welcome back to part 2 of this groundbreaking Antarctica episode. Forget about all the hype out there. I think Clif is gonna put this to new heights, pun intended. And when right before the break, Clif, we went into the pure existential aspects of these things, and I know we also touched up on the ancient stuff. So I think we should take it from there and like I said, try to move up in the timeline. Do you have anything to add to the note where we're at?
Nothing that occurs. No, I'm happy to move into more modern times.
Well, let's see. Let's not go too fast because, like I said, we have traces from these urns that the Russian found, and according to them, it was a pretty old civilization. So I think that if it's connected to the what we today call the Atlantic, I think it could have been maybe the mother culture of Atlantis, or predating Atlantis maybe, because I'm pretty sure that Atlantis, and I won't go into that here now because we have programs, some recorded already about that.
Yeah, I understand.
That what we call Atlantis today is a reference to maybe a colony or a survival of this culture that was in the Antarctic ridge. But according to your model, maybe there's no room for a continent in the Atlantic ridge, because maybe you reject the notion of tectonic. Yep.
Yeah, the tectonic plates move, but the mechanism and everything that is proffered for them is, in my opinion, bogus, that they're moving because of the expansion of the Earth. The expansion of the Earth can be thought of as occurring because of high-energy particles from outer space. So this gets really weird, okay? The sun is mostly iron, with gold and silver and a few other heavy metals in it. It's not nuclear. There's no hydrogen fuel or any of that. It resembles nothing so much as the tip of a TIG torch, the ignited tungsten in an electrified ionized atmosphere.
Yeah, but it's a matter of science. We know that cosmic radiation, although we don't know everything about it, we know that those high frequencies do indeed influence everything on the sun.
Right.
No, I mean on the Earth.
On the Earth. But see, here's the mechanism by which I was going to direct our thinking.
Okay.
If you took, for example, that our Earth does not have a molten
core,
that our Earth is alive, and its core is in fact a plasma, a very highly energetic electric.
A sun.
Correct.
Right.
As though it might be considered to be a sun, then that plasma has a very interesting characteristic. Plasmas capture cosmic rays.
Right.
Now, in the case of our sun, as the sun's energetic activity dampens down cyclically, there are going to be times that more cosmic rays come around the sun to strike the planets behind it, including ourselves. We're in one of those periods of times now. And the more cosmic rays that come through, we're now learning that, oh, look, this cosmic ray barrage that hit us in 2003 not only stripped off 5.5% of our physical atmosphere and 15% of its depth, but it caused the Banda Aceh earthquake. And it may be stated that the cause of that earthquake was an expansion event that occurred as a result of these cosmic rays coming in and being caught by the plasma within the middle of the Earth. Mm-hmm. And then if we extend that thinking a little bit further, as that plasma grows, there's something that is around it, which is the rest of the planet. And so all this energy coming into the plasma has to do something because it can't grow infinitely. And so what actually occurs is energy becomes so condensed, so packed in there, that it actually converts into matter. And so it's the reverse of a nuclear explosion, so to speak, and it's a matter creation event. And those matter creation events cause the Earth to expand because we're expanding from the middle out. And thus we crack the way we do. So it's as though we had a rigid shell around an orange. As it's growing, that shell is going to crack, the skin is going to crack as the orange grows within it and pressurizes it. And it's very much that kind of a situation with the Earth. And so our Earth is gaining cosmic rays that come on down. They go through all of us. They smack right through the planet itself, the matter, but they get captured by the energy at the core of our particular planet. Now, we know that this is not occurring with Mars, that Mars is a dead planet relative to its core. And it may be as a result.
So the inner sun in Mars is either altered or dead?
Correct.
It can't be dead, because then it wouldn't have atmosphere and gravity and all that.
No, those are immaterial to that.
Oh, okay.
Newton was wrong. Gravity does not relate to mass or that level of energetic activity. So it would retain its gravity even after. Earth would retain its gravity.
Could it still harbor life?
Correct. It still could.
Wow.
But the thinking is at the moment that something occurred to Mars, where Mars was struck by
obviously
a very large object, not the nuclear explosions that what's his name talks about.
Yeah, Brandenburg. No, obviously the exploded planet of Van Flandern, obviously.
Correct.
Because you can see that the south side of Mars was tilted towards that, so it must have been, it really got a beating. Even we got a lot of water, but we don't have to go too much into that, because we just had a program with Joseph Farrell called, it's not out yet, but it's called Ancient War in Heaven, and we go very deeply into the exploded planet hypothesis.
Well, then we can just jump ahead, so to speak.
Yeah, because at this point when people listen to this, that program will already be out.
Okay, cool.
They know about
this helps. This helps a lot.
Yep.
Okay, so Earth then is actually in an expansion condition all the time, and the North Atlantic Ridge is a result of that expansion. So all of these things are new and modern and not part of ancient anything. And in fact, as an oceanographer, I studied oceanography for a while when I was a kid, thinking I was going to go into that, but there was life turned me another direction. In any event, though, if you study oceanography, you find a very shocking fact that nobody denies, they just can't explain. And that is that the bottoms of our oceans are newer than any of the land on the surface.
Wow.
And since the bottom of the ocean...
But hang on. They say that the Caledonian mountain range, which I incidentally live on, is the oldest and most stable.
Okay.
That doesn't compute with this model. Or does it?
Sure it does. It's not in conflict at all.
Okay.
We're expanding, and the easiest place for the expansion to occur is at the weakest spot of the surrounding envelope to that expansion. The weakest spot in our Earth is the middle of all the oceans. Okay, so we're always adding new land in the Pacific. There's no such thing as, by the way, as a subduction zone. You can't find a subduction zone anywhere on this planet. Anywhere they go...
Sorry, what does that... I'm not familiar with that term, subduction.
Subduction zone is the area where supposedly the Pacific plate is diving in underneath the North American plate, and that's what causes the ring of fire in the North America. It's the idea that the Pacific plate of the ocean, that underlies the ocean, is being shoved under the North American continent. The two grind together and create volcanoes and stuff. That's a bunch of absolute excrement. It's really poor thinking.
And just for those folks out there who are not aware, these things aren't written in stone. We learn it in school as if it's a matter of fact, but they're just as much of a hypothesis, or a theory, maybe is better to say, as is evolution, relativity, all that stuff. It's not like proven beyond any
exactly
doubt. So it's room for alternating schools, and there's always been competing schools of thought in these sciences about how these things work. So I just have to throw that out there before anyone thinks you're a complete kook who just takes everything out of your ass. This is legitimate. It is just that you're in a minor school compared to the dominant uniformitarian today. Right.
And as I have stated in the past, just because I may be crazy does not necessarily make you wrong.
Exactly. Truth is what it is.
Exactly. And so you can't find a subduction zone anywhere. So the tectonic plate model is basically bogus, and it was the representation of the thinking at the time. And as you say, officialdom just teaches it to us now because it keeps us quiet, so to speak, right? And they don't have to go into stuff that they don't really want us to think about or explain. But because we have this expansion event model, then it eliminates the idea that Lemuria is at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean or that Atlantis is at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, because those are new territories recently created.
Well, then you're hard pressed to explain the pyramids that's in bottom of these oceans.
No,
how do you explain
because
that?
those are not in the bottom of the ocean. Those are on the part of the shallow littoral zone. At some point, it was a littoral zone. It was within the tidal area. It's not within what we describe as benthic or the desert areas of the ocean. It's still within what we would think of as the continental shelf. So you don't have, for instance, pyramids at the bottom of the ocean. Yet we find pyramids and structures all along submerged areas of the continental shelf.
Yeah.
Big difference, okay? And so there is no pyramid at the
So it's just if the water was lower,
exactly,
it would still be connected to our current land.
just as we see in India. If the water were 120 feet lower, India would be 60% larger, and we would see civilizations that, or remnants of a civilization that would have held twice the current population of India.
Yeah, and because people have always settled more in the coastal zones than in the mountains and inland, so it's totally logical that most of the huge cities would be in zones that are now submerged all over the world.
Correct. And we see that no matter what, even in current civilizations now, you always have less of a population inland than you do along the coast.
Yeah.
And also we have all kinds of historical references that go back like to these stela that are within North America and throughout the Pacific region that were related to the Egyptians, because there's some discussion about how there were bands of stela off of New Zealand as though they were put in as navigation markers, and then within 20 years they had to do it all over again as the waters increased, and then within 20 years they had to do it all over again. And so that there were these three zones, so to speak. And we also find this off of Japan. There appears to be three stages of construction that seem to have had to react to increasing water levels, and then finally they gave it up or something occurred, and then we don't see a continuity from that point forward. And that's probably when this Great War business happened.
Yeah, that we also cover. You said the name earlier in part one. We call that show Ancient War in Heaven.
Correct. Correct.
War in Heaven, indeed.
Correct, yes.
Language. But that means that according to your model then, there's not room for a Lemuria or an Atlantis in the traditional places. They would have to be...
Correct.
So the current continents are more or less the same as they've always been then?
No. Continents, of course, are shredded in the process of the expansion. So that's why if you go to the YouTube, you can look for Neil Adams, and he has some nice graphic video.
Okay, so all the land masses were one once.
Correct.
And then
Right. And then we had our first expansion event, and we got a crack somewhere, a little water went into it, and we've been cracking and splitting ever since. And we'll continue to do this such that the idea...
But that's pretty mainstream. I mean, that's the mainstream model that is just, I think, the details here that are different.
No, huge difference, because they say that the cracking and the splitting and stuff occurred on a sphere of the same size. I'm saying that the sphere has grown some 60%.
Yeah, right. In addition, yeah.
In addition to that. So we have a much larger area now. And as a result, I can also, if I were precise enough, so I was a student in a gymnasium in Germany in the 1960s. And one of the things they did to teach us physics was they had us measure the planet the way the Egyptians used to do by taking sun sites at the bottom of wells and have the wells be 200 miles apart. In relative latitude, and you do timing and all of this, and then you can make estimates as to how big the planet is based on the time and so on, right? So you're actually measuring the planet by physical stuff. And had we been precise enough then, I could take those results some nearly 60 or nearly 56 years later and do it again, and I'm sure I would find that my measurements were for a larger planet, albeit, slightly larger, but I'm certain that even in that 60 years, we've had enough expansion that it would be measurable.
According to this model then, Atlantis would have to be in Antarctica then, because there's no room for a Lemuria or Atlantis in Pacific and Atlantic Ocean.
Correct. Plus, there's something else about that. We don't see subsidence. All right. There's never been a continent that's subsided. There's never been a continent that's been overtaken by water. There's never been a 1,000-foot high tsunami, displacement wave, or anything like that. All right.
Have you heard about Friesland?
Well, sure. Yeah. Yeah. But see, all of these can be explained in a much easier fashion under the expansion of the Earth model.
Okay.
And it relates to, so for instance, right now, the theoretical and maximal height that could be achieved by a tsunami anywhere around the planet is about 80 feet at the beach. And if you had a large enough tsunami, it could, in some areas, push to maybe 100 feet, several miles inland up on low-lying areas. But there's evidence of tsunamis, or water impacts rather, 6 and 7 and 800 feet up on many mountains in the Americas. The Americas has a more pristine case for the catastrophe than other areas, all right? Mm-hmm. Simply because humans haven't eroded these markers. But at the time that those catastrophes happened, where the water was up 600 and 700 feet up on these mountains, the Earth was ever so much smaller, and so we had a different set of actual physical circumstances relative to how a tsunami would manifest. You can see that as in this model, as the Earth expands, tsunamis over time are eventually going to get down to where they could not physically rise up above a certain height. Make sense?
Yeah, kind of. But
okay.
But would we expand together with the Earth so we become bigger?
No, that's
why not?
I don't see. There's no reason that humans should expand because the Earth itself is expanding due to the cosmic rays that it captures and the new matter it creates in the middle of the Earth. We have the cosmic rays and stuff go right through us, and our size is determined in an entirely different manner than the planet.
Well, but it's determined by the planet's condition, like the size and the gravity and stuff like that.
Okay, you're thinking in Newtonian terms, and Newton was wrong. We proved that on the moon. According to Newton, the moon has a gravity that is 1/6 of the Earth because of its relative mass. And yet when we go on up there, and the Chinese just did it again, and they measure gravity, it's closer to 3/4 of what we have here on Earth. And so that blows Newton totally out of the water.
Okay, I buy that, but I just think you chose a poor example because you know as well as me that the moon is a freak of nature. So
okay, all right, exactly so. It's not natural at all.
Use something else. What about Mars? Would Mars be shrinking if that can't produce any more matter if the sun is dead?
Correct, it cannot, and it's not shrinking, but it's not growing. And we know that when Mars got smacked, it got smacked on, let's just say, on the southern hemisphere, and it got hit so hard by a chunk of something that it created a divot on the other side of the planet. So the concussion wave went all the way through the core of the planet, and it's thought at that point that that's when the core of the planet died, or became so injured that we're still not seeing any sign of recovery.
No, I don't trust a planet with a dead core, so that crushes all hopes of Mars being a future human colony.
I would agree.
Well,
also, we find that if you look in the Jain literature, Jain is a religion out of India. It's a minority religion, but they've got a really interesting take on things and a very...
Kind of a mix of Islam and Hinduism or something like that?
No, it's more like Sikhism than Islam because they believe in a non-personified pulse.
Oh, sorry, I mixed it with Sikhism. Yeah, you're right. Jainism. Yeah, it's a very peace-loving religion.
Correct, and these guys have something that's really cool, which is this incredible. I don't want to say unbroken, but an incredible historical record and a cosmology that can be validated by the internal references within the document to astrology or to astronomy that we can now plot and figure out what days and times that could have possibly occurred.
Yeah.
And so their cosmology goes to state that humans lived on 2.5 islands of life in this solar system, those 2.5 islands being Earth,
and Mars,
Moon, and Mars.
Oh, so the half is Moon.
Correct, and we were 600 billion.
Right. 600 billion.
Correct, on those three. And that was at the height of this civilization, and at the time, most of us were blue or green in skin.
This corresponds with a show we just had. It's not out yet. It's called... what's it called? Human prehistory, according to Esoterica, that the blue race died out, that there were actually, they use colors, so they said there were yellow, black, white, red, and blue.
Yeah.
and blue died out. Many of the ancient, I think also in the many traditional Hindu lore accounts for the blue races too.
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. They're well aware of that. They also show the green people, though.
Wow. Not little green men.
No, not little green men.
So I have to ask you then, Cliff, because some ancient lore, because I've been studying in many mystery schools in my life, traditional, esoteric.
Yeah.
So I found once, and that was long before I got interested in this stuff we're talking about now. I was more into, symbolism, and I didn't take things as literal back then.
Sure.
And they talked about different human races, or I should say the origins to the human races, because today we were so mixed. But they said that there were different origins on different planets. So do you have any thoughts about that for like green people, blue people, etc.?
Sure. Okay, so insofar as the most my model of my understanding is going to reflect some understanding of what the British royals think in terms of how humans came about, and how some of the powers that be think that humans came about. Okay. And so it brings in the idea of panspermia, and that the hominid form of 4 senses and a cranium and a physical body, bipedal, erect, etc., and with a vertebra, is more common throughout universe than we would tend to guess. And so more space aliens...
that's the ancient lore too, that human being is a template.
Correct.
And that if you wiped out all human beings on Earth and life began over again, it was still, when it comes to our kind of intelligence, our kind of consciousness, our kind of entity. I'm not talking about entities like suns and planets, because they can be argued are alive too.
Sure.
But they're a completely different state of being. But the ancient law says that, this is our level of consciousness would be a human being.
Yes.
Not a lizard man, not a insectoid alien or anything like that.
That we would end up more or less the way we are. Right.
Yeah.
And that's my... general take of it, but that's a very there's no causative elements involved, and so I have these causative elements in this understanding, and my understanding goes back to this group of people that they call the Nommo, and the Nommo are aquatic beings that are basically bipedal, although they have fins and flippers instead of feet as we would understand it. But they would have arms, and in many ways would look like what we would think of as very ugly mermaids. And I say mermaids because the Nommo are as a species are always at any given time about 98% female. Wow. And they're like those fish, and they make themselves male if procreation is needed. The Nommo are a very sophisticated understanding of we have a very sophisticated understanding of the Nommo. It comes from the Mali people and the Dogon people and other people in Africa, but there's also representations in India, even with the Manu myth. And we take our part of it from the Noah myths, right? Where the guy on the land is
Gilgamesh.
Exactly. And he's told by a fish that there's a big flood coming. Well, that fish is the Nommo. It's a representation of the Nommo. And these guys exist.
Oneness or something like that in traditional mythology? I think it's oneness, right. The fish god.
And we even have that up here with the Salish. Okay, I find that the Pacific coast of the U.S., the North Pacific coast, and the Pacific Rim cultures have a more pristine version of a mythology than we find other areas. And so in the Salish area, they called the Nommo Changer. And Changer came to our planet, in order to rectify a great sin, that the original sin, okay, the original sin is not ours. The original sin was the fault of the Nommo, and I can go into that if we care to divert. But the Nommo created an ecological catastrophe. They let things calm down. They figured out, and then they came back and they cleaned the planet up from the ecological catastrophe that they had allowed to be created. And then they set about trying to rectify things. And according to the Salish myths up here, which are the expositor is Raven, Raven was the first creature that was modified by Nommo, and to make amends for this great sin that they had allowed to occur against the earth.
The bird Raven?
The bird raven, correct. And so Raven is the expositor. He tells the tale of walking along as Changer does his work. And Changer creates salmon. Changer creates all of the creatures in the ocean. Changer creates the vertebrates. And basically the whole story is about, Earth is 100% invertebrate. And then Changer comes and creates life, more complex and stuff that it had allowed to be destroyed. And so from this, we get Raven telling the story of Changer going around and how Changer is aquatic. It lives in the littoral zone, the tidal zone. It comes out on land grudgingly and for it under relatively harsh conditions. And its feet are such that it can't walk. So it has a device that it calls a shoe that allows it to float above the surface of the planet as it goes about its business. And then there's all of these myths about the Nommo coming on in and fixing up the planet that they had damaged, and they create all the way up to humans. And then we also assume, as an aside here, we assume that they left some of the humans to be aquatic. And so there may indeed be races of humans living at the bottom of the ocean in tribes that we're just not aware of. But in any event, the point here too is that Nommo was but the first. And now Nommo had enemies, all right? And this may or may not relate to the Great War in Space. I just don't know, because we're talking about something extremely ancient here with the Nommo. But the British believe that the British royals believe, and every year they celebrate their connection to the Nommo. They go all the way, yes. When the Queen and Chucky, the heir apparent, go and sit on this stone in Wales to reestablish their authority over the country of the island of England and their dominion on the earth, they go through this ritual that relates them back to the great sin, the problems that were created, and so on. And so, just briefly,
I have to admit, I'm pretty skeptical to the notion that those kind of people have any kind of spirituality. Sure, they may have rituals and remnants, but you see their consciousness pretty clear. It seems they're only worshipping mammon and ego. And
okay, you're correct. Yes, I agree. And so we need to divert into the actual story. Okay. Okay. So the Nommo come here and they find Earth, and Earth has a number of complex beings on it that are not human. And I'm not even sure that they were vertebrates. But Nommo is a vertebrate, and Nommo is a self-generating being. So an individual Nommo knows when its body is going to die, and it gets itself pregnant, creates a new Nommo, and in the process of that birth, it transfers its consciousness into that new being and that new body. And so the Nommo is, in that sense, immortal. All right, but eternal, but it doesn't do it in the same body. It goes from body to body to body, but with a very brief transition. Okay, so the Nommo come to the planet Earth, and they took samples, and because their thing is to create things. They're creator class of beings. They go from planet to planet wherever they can, and basically are like Johnny Appleseeds. They seed life, complex life, right? Anyway, and their whole thing, according to what can be determined, is that they're trying to create vessels for souls to bind to, such that there's more opportunities for more incarnation and the complexity of universe grows appropriately. In any event, though, so they come here, they take some samples, they go away, they grow some beings that we would consider to be quasi-humanoid, and they come back. Now, here's the thing about Nommo. As I noted earlier, they're all female, except that they change to become male when it's necessary that procreation should occur. Well, they inculcated this paradigm to the hominids that they were going to seed on this planet. And so they brought back these beings that were basically androgynous and could be either male or female at will.
Oh, this was before the split of the genders,
right? Correct. Okay, so here's what happens. They bring back eight of these beings with them to seed. So they thought these 8 beings would be the new new race on planet Earth. Well, when they get here, 2 of the beings actually commit a sin in the eyes of the Nommo, And thus we get this idea of a soul taint or an original sin. And these two beings fell in love, but they fell in love out of season and in inappropriate genders. So they were both male at the time that they fell in love. One of them converted back to female to have progeny, and that's not the way it was supposed to work, and it was against the Nommo's rules, so to speak, right?
Okay.
And so this may be our original.
So love was a sin for them, despite how wise their allegedly was.
Correct. Well, because in their species, you had to mate according to and do this procreation according to all different kinds of protocols, right?
History repeats itself, if you ask me. But okay, yeah.
Okay, and this may be why we have prejudice against
Exactly.
homosexuals and everything, right?
Yep.
In any event, though, so here's what happens: they create a progeny, and that progeny goes mad. And so they're here on Earth, and the Nommo are very interesting because they don't use like UFO time folding kind of techniques to get from A to B. They may indeed employ that, but when they're actually powering through into solar systems and stuff, they did it by a mechanism that was described as a liquid copper engine. All right, we don't know anything about it other than that brief description, except that this progeny of these two individuals. Now, that progeny is seized upon and declared to be the original ancestor of the British royals. And in fact, all royals on the planet all claim that they are descendant from that original.
I buy that for pharaohs and stuff, but today's royals? I don't
Today's
know.
royals, when they're on that rock in Wales, the heir apparent must acknowledge to his parent or the person that's sitting in that stone that they are both descendant from that sea monster, and those are the terms they use: sea monster or aquatic monster.
Wow.
And in any event, so they do it every year, and so this has been going on for presumably as long as there have been these royals, as they've been tying themselves to this lineage.
They are inbred, we know that, yeah.
Correct. And they're so reluctant to breed out of it because they think of themselves as tied to that particular line. So what happens?
Yeah, but I think the line was broken around the Merovingians. They may have the lore and the customs like a museum, but you really think they have managed to preserve their blood? Now we're getting...
No. And I never even go that far. I don't care what their understanding is. Or
that's David Icke territory, you know.
Exactly, and they might even be completely crazy and quite wrong. So, you know.
But it's interesting that the point isn't that they are a different species than us, but that they have preserved this and that they, to some extent, may even believe it.
Correct, but we do know that humanity is a hybrid species. We know this, and we have it demonstrated to us every year as women that are Rh negative try to give birth to Rh positive children, and their body tries to reject the fetus.
Yep.
We are indeed a hybrid species. In any event, I'll get done with this story here real quick.
Yep.
The progeny grows up to be what we would think of as a young adult, and he's not mentally stable, and he steals one of the Nommo's spaceships and is unable to exit the planet, comes back down and crashes on the Earth and causes a catastrophe as the liquid copper engine pollutes the whole of the Earth's atmosphere and ecosystem.
Is this when there was a global fire on Earth?
Correct. And so at that point, the Nommo and the remaining and their 8 breeding people, their 8 humans, hop into spaceships and beat feet to get away from the disaster.
Clever.
Some time passes and they all come back. Only now it's a much larger, and it's known or thought of that there were 144 hominids that were brought back to help repair. And the 100
Was there any survivors?
Oh yeah. The only one that actually died in this was the insane progeny. Apparently, the Nommo and the other breeding pairs were able to escape the planet in the other spaceships.
And didn't many people flee underground?
There were no people in our understanding at that point.
Oh, okay.
There were only invertebrates. We're talking millions of years back.
Yeah.
Because see this. Okay, now this goes on to more ancient but more modern history of like the Anunnaki. Okay. Now, everybody says, or a lot of people will state in the woo-woo world of the New Age movement that the Anunnaki are the creators of humans. and I dispute this. The Anunnaki are merely following the Nommo. The Nommo always had enemies. They've always been fighting the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki are DNA harvesters, not creators, so to speak. So they're not great engineers. They can just tinker with the stuff that they already find. The Anunnaki were created by the Nommo, and they went and, as the Nommo do, they allow all these beings to decide their own destiny and path. And so the Anunnaki, as they are, but they resent the Nommo being their creators and are always following behind them, taking, and according to my way of thinking, they're claiming the status of the Nommo as creator when in fact they were just tinkerers. You know, they didn't build the car, they're just the mechanic that knows how to fix it.
That makes sense. And this dovetails so much with a show we had with a theosophist who accounted for the stanzas of Xian. I can hear that there's many similarities. You just have a more, should I say, easier, less symbolic take on it, easier to understand for our modern consciousness,
right?
The way you describe it. But it's common source. If you rely on those ancient sources in among Jainis, that should be compatible with the other scriptures in that area, Vedas, Upanishads, all that stuff.
Exactly. It's the same damn story, no matter where you go.
Yep. Only it's better to get it in its most original sense rather than the more degenerated. And
that's why I like the Salish, because the Salish people up here have been less polluted. They're more isolated and self-isolating.
Right.
They've kept their mythos very clean. They don't even write it down very much. And their stories are very precise in because when they're repeated, and there's this word habu, which is the habu people say in the audience, which is words of encouragement for the storyteller. But storytellers around here in the Salish tradition, they're not allowed to substitute their interpretation or their words.
Yep.
They can certainly embellish, but the core story is known so well that everybody can repeat certain key passages word for word on the whole part of the story.
This is just so people understand, this is how it used to be. All over the earth. You can, for instance, go to Caucasus, the Caucasian mountains. Do you still have a few Ashoks around? There, it's a role, it's a job, like a shaman or whatever. Someone in the tribe has the job of being the one who can remember what happened.
Correct.
And they have to memorize extreme details because it's all oral. Nothing was written in the really old days, for good reason, because see how fragile it is. Not even buildings are left, right? So
correct.
So, but consciousness is left. So the reason I mentioned the Caucasus Mountains is that they have a very interesting tradition, and that is that different people, because it's a melting pot of ethnicity, religion, culture. But what they did, all of them, no matter where they came from, is that they sent their ashoks, their memory preservers, to grand conventions with other people's ashoks, and then they had competitions, like sport,
right,
where there was, and this was all embellished in poetry, because in poetry you have a system of rhythm and rhyme, so it's much easier to preserve memory if you have that kind of structure to it.
Yeah.
And so they would have competitions where they would exchange stuff, and they were also allowed to be creative. They had to repeat what was known, but they could do it in new ways. And I would say a few sentences, and then you would say a few sentences, and that way they actually exchanged information too. Let's not. We're losing ourselves here, but I think it's interesting for people to know that this isn't like a freak incident up where you live. This is how it used to be before all culture were eradicated by modernity.
Yeah.
So I'm just substantiating what you're saying, if you catch my drift.
Yeah, sure. And I actually used to live when I was a child. I was a free-range kid in Alaska back before it became a state, when it was still a territory. And we, because of the nature...
You're that old?
Yes, I'm an old bastard, yeah.
Okay, wow. Kudos, man.
Thank you.
And still you're so up to date on stuff like bitcoins and computers and whatnot.
I'm ahead of date.
It's amazing.
That's my curse, is that I live about 2 years out in time. So it can be very disconcerting, and it can cause you problems, and it can get irritating when you're impatient.
Right.
Anyway, okay, so I am indeed that old. But my father, in his position with the military, it was such that we had a lot of tribal contact with the Dinglet, and then so I lived tribal, from the
Right.
time I was able to even get up and walk and go pet the sled dogs.
Yeah, sure.
So I've heard it, and that's the way it's done. It's just,
Cool.
that was always my understanding of how history should be transmitted.
Yeah.
And they would get in there and they would riff. They would call the poems their songs.
Yep.
But other than that, it's exactly the same thing. And the convocations, the huge gatherings where you would have dozens of storytellers, and they would go on for days, days and days, and you'd drift in and out. It's like sort of like a modern, sort of like a rock festival.
That's a great analogy, yeah. Only with contents. But
Correct. Yeah.
People are probably firing up the torches now because we've left Antarctica subject, although this is very interesting. Maybe we should have you back
Well, let's return to Antarctica by way of the myths of the Pacific Islanders, okay?
Yep.
Because the myths of the Pacific Islanders say that there was a war between peoples, between the Sky people and the Star people, and that when this war was fought, humans huddled in caves and places to get out of the collateral damage, and that from the position that the Salish occupied, they could see. So up here in the Pacific Northwest, because the Salish are a small group around Puget Sound, but they could see the reflection in the atmosphere of the what we would think of as the bombardments that were occurring in northern Africa. And they could see the downpouring from a huge height as all of the clouds of the planet, insofar as they could see, were sucked to the south. And that's when Antarctica was frozen. So whoever did it, in their view, Antarctica was frozen as a result of an act of war.
Right. Well, according to your model, we can salvage the notions of these ancient civilizations because Antarctica, yes, but you also have Greenland.
Sure.
As a good example of where one of these other ancient continents can have been. Then if they're not disappearing under the sea, we have to look elsewhere. And then you have Antarctica, and then you have Greenland, and you also have, of course, Sahara and the Gobi Desert. Under all those four areas, I'm pretty sure stuff will be unearthed if we were looking.
My way of thinking is both Gobi and Sahara will be slim pickings because that's where the bombardment was. That's where the burning was. Right. But Antarctica, that's why I'm always have been so whipped up about it, because it was frozen, flash frozen, preserved.
Well, the same with Greenland.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and
even the saying now, the scientists up here are saying that if the ice in Greenland, which I think will happen now, will drift out in the sea, then that island will rise.
Yeah, yeah, and that, I suspect that when we actually get that at some point we'll get reverberations through the planet as Antarctica rises, as the ice falls off.
So then that may cause a domino effect to places like Greenland.
Correct.
Interesting.
Earthquakes and volcanoes and all of this kind of thing. And coincidentally, by the way, okay, so here we are in the planet Earth. We're not revolving around the equator of the sun. We're actually being dragged behind it along in a cone with all the other planets, and our planet is growing. As our planet grows, it's going to drift back further away from the sun and resettle in a slightly different orbit. This has occurred in the past. We know that we have 365.25 days in our annual orbit now. It used to be 360. Before that, it was 251, and so on. And so the Earth is, every time it grows, it increases its orbital length. We get a longer year. And
but does it grow step by step, incrementally, or in big leaps?
Episodes, not incrementally. No, it's episodic. And we know that this episodic nature can be tied to a bunch of different cycles, two of which we're into right now. All right. So every 425 years, for a period of 125 years, we have a situation where the large planets cluster on the same side of the cone trailing behind the sun as ourselves, as does Earth. And so our orbit lengthens by about 3%. In so doing, it causes us to be influenced by these large planets in a mass form. And so every 425 years, not only do we get a mini ice age, but we also get lots of Earth expansion effects. And if we track these 425-year cycles back, they include such things as the explosions in Krakatoa. And if you went back far enough, you would find that the cycle coincided with the explosions in Yellowstone. And so during this period of time, Earth is very unstable, and our continents are drifting apart as we're actually being pulled further apart by these planets. Now, it grows because we create new matter. Well, coincidentally, every 425 years, for a period of 125 years, the Earth enters into a mini ice age. This mini ice age occurs because of what the sun does, where the sun's corona drops down in size. It's no longer 5,000 Kelvin. It drops down to about 3,000 Kelvin. And much more, much more, maybe 40 or 50% more cosmic rays slip around the sun to come into the inner planets, as opposed to when the corona is out there and is acting as an energetic screen for many of these particles. And so coincidentally, with the large planets being over on our side of our orbit, so to speak, relative to the sun, all of us clustered over on the same side of the cone. Coincident to that, we also have this dimming of the sun, more cosmic rays coming down, which allows for more energy to be trapped and more expansion within the Earth. So, and then also, so that's one cycle, this mini ice age cycle that goes all the way back to, well, as we go back, we'll step through things like the Maunder minimum. Just coincidentally, all this timing is perfect, right? Then there's these things called Mankolovich cycles, and those are every 100,000 years. And we are slightly overdue for one of those, and we're just now entering into it, and it should be very effective for us around 2024. And it's a 100,000-year cycle that's also tied to very large expansion events. And so
hey, have your computer oracle found any pointings to that time?
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. We've been, I've been just going on and on about all kinds of earthquakes, volcanoes, and other weird things going on since 2000. And in 2003 or 4, I started getting language that ultimately I decided I would call rivers in the sky and lakes in the sky. Absolutely new phenomenon relative to modern humanity. And we've had these appear. So those data sets are indeed prescient, and they are so far quite accurate, and has been reasonable to give us some hints and warnings of the kinds of things we're going to be going through relative to these processes over the next 125 years.
Okay, that's another show though. But
yes.
but I may inquire about safe zones in the break. Anyway, so let's get back to Antarctica then. We have now a backstory for some of the very, very ancient stuff. Is there anything else in history we should touch before we move up to contemporary times?
The only thing to touch on is to have a continuing note that the Smithsonian is a danger to history, and that they are scrubbers of it, and so
complete bastards.
Exactly,
they destroy stuff.
Exactly, and so far we have not seen that organization move into Antarctica in any way, shape, or form. So I think most of it is still relatively preserved.
I think that's for practical reasons, because if they can find something there which will be useful for them for one of two purposes, either profit or technology, especially weaponry, then they won't allow these crooks like that. Those crooks like that are more gatekeepers for our main culture. And stuff that they think is not that interesting, let's say a weird kind of human skeleton, okay, you can crush that. But here, and at the end, I want to talk about the scenarios of what's really going on there, but we don't have to get there immediately.
Okay.
So yeah, I think it's a good thing they haven't let those crooks loose, but I think it's pragmatic reasons.
It may be the case. Indeed, they may just say, nope, this stuff's too valuable to let you people
exactly.
Not show it.
Ideology always yields, if it's money
to practicality.
or war.
Exactly. Right. And that's why I say CERN and the Large Hadron Collider, and the reason they're doing it is just a huge pile of bovine excrement.
Yeah, I've heard you talk about that, and I would inquire you if we had better time, but let's not go there today.
Yeah.
That's a can of worms, man.
Yeah, you're closer to it than I am, yeah.
Oh my God, yeah. So, well, let's hope the Earth expands a little rapidly soon, so I'll get further away.
There you go, yeah.
So, we're moving on to, I guess the Nazis will be the next chapter, or is there any noteworthy stuff before them?
There was a lot of,
Bird, obviously.
Correct. Well, even with Amundsen and some of the Norwegian explorers, their notes about the peculiar effects and the things that they saw at Antarctica, and then Byrd with his understanding of things and his flying about. So, but other than that, our major intrusion then is with the Germans, and then at some point it becomes the Nazis, right? So it started off with a German interest. I think probably driven by energy, because bear in mind, you can actually see hints in the late 1800s, 1896 or 7, something like that. There was an article that talked about the potential for Antarctica recently discovered and recently landed upon at that time by the Russians, and some stuff coming out of Moscow that had been written up in an article in the New York Times, which was more scandalous then and more tabloid than it is now. Mm-hmm. And it was talking about the idea that Germany would be down there energetically mining for coal and looking at it as an energy source. So even then, in the late 1800s, we see there were references of German presence, or at least thinking about going down there, to the point that it percolates into the articles in the mainstream media.
And why not? Because the Germans, far earlier than the Nazi Empire, had huge colonies in the landmass that is geographically closest to Antarctica, namely the Patagonia area.
Sure.
If you see the map, you'll see that south of Argentina is the closest. And not just because they are the southest, further south than South Africa, further south than New Zealand, but also because that area of Antarctica has the largest landmass closest to it. So it's not that far off a gap, actually. So why wouldn't they be interested in their immediate neighbor land? That's just logical, right?
Correct. And also Germany was late in the colony rush, because they didn't have a huge navy. So unlike the Dutch, who were out trying to colonize the South China Sea and take over parts of China and these kind of things, the Germans were left behind as a major empire in terms of colonies. They got a couple of small ones in Africa, but in terms of the slicing and dicing of the planet to the major European powers, they were late to the table. So they had further pickings. They had to go further away to get it. And here was the idea of an ultimate prize. And so it makes a lot of sense that the German hierarchy, and that I use that word loosely, okay, because my people are Germanic. My father's people are from Germany way back when, but because I've lived there and stuff, and am aware of the history of it. A lot of, when you say Nazis, everybody thinks of, or there's a common perception of a megalithic kind of a Nazi empire. And that really is, nothing could be further from the truth. The Germanic states were always warring states among themselves, and once they consolidated under, I think it was the first Frederick, the King of Prussia, that took over and made the largest Germanic state to that point, the fractured part of it continued within their military, even within the various forces there. So you would have the German Navy that was vying against the German Army, that was vying against the German Air Force, all operating their own military-industrial complex, in essence.
Sounds
so
we see USA Today.
Correct. And it's the model we took. There's a lot of Germanic people. German is still the second, outside of Spanish, it's the second largest language group in the U.S. So we get to that point where the Germans decided, okay, they were going to go on down, and they took a slightly different approach to it, which was in the 30s, they were going to basically colonize big chunks of Antarctica. This is before the Antarctic collective agreement among all of the modern states. and the Germans were going to just colonize it, basically, move people in and all of this kind of stuff and exploit the land and the resources, and chose that area that they called New Schwabenland. And then we start getting all of the
like I say, that's the first casualty of the Second World War, the first annexed country. They think it's Poland. No, it's Norway.
No, yeah. Yeah, it was taking over territory in Antarctica. And then we never really hear, or there is very little continuity of history to provide us an idea of what the hell they were doing there. But we get all...
And we don't have to go too much in detail because we've covered this in other shows and we're going to cover it with other people. But it's worth mentioning that they put it went completely black.
Correct. And I was just, the point I wanted to bring up was that when I first when I was first in country in Germany as part of the occupation forces dependents. So my father was a military officer who was there after the war as part of the occupation forces, and we were allowed concurrent travel and stayed in Germany with him. And so things were reasonably peaceful then in the late 50s, early 60s. But when I first went there, they were in the process of a cleanup of their museums and all of this sort of thing of pre-war history, basically. And at the time, I assumed they were trying to sanitize their culture from the
Nazi heritage.
Correct. But in fact, what turned out to be was a selective plucking out of all of these museums. And there were a number of museums in the area that we were staying at, which was near Stuttgart. Southern Germany. And there were a number of museums that had South Pole exhibits, and those were removed. And I remember as a school child going I was at a German school, and we would go with English teachers. It was just a weird situation with other students that were French and Russian and Polish and so on. But we would go and look at these museums, and there was 2 museums that were reasonably close that I actually went to on my own after the class experience because they were just chock full of Antarctic stuff. Wow. Everything from stuffed penguins to...
But was this stuff that was brought there during the Nazi period or even before?
No, earlier. Because, see, here's the thing. So much of the... cultural infrastructure of Germany was destroyed, that those that were left were highly prized and used. Okay, so just curiously, at that time in the 60s, there were more Germans in their German museums than any foreigners, even under organized circumstances. We were always outnumbered by the local population looking at stuff. And it's because they had so few museums left after the bombings and so on, right?
And people need to know also that before the Nazis took over, Germany was the last, should I say, occult, or if you go back to this diversion in Royal Society and among scientists, we have the more spiritual scientists and the more materialist scientists. So the last bastion, the last, what you say in English, you say... redoubt of the spiritual traditions were in Germany. There was, before the Nazis took over, there were even occultists were even marching in the streets, taking part in the political battles that were going on. So and alchemists and scientists were often one and the same. So there was a lot of room for this old alternative thinking that was eradicated after the war, probably because it was associated with Nazism, or even more probably because materialists had entered and they didn't want any,
references to consciousness being supreme.
Exactly.
Correct. And so, that's really the business I'm in these days, is consciousness science. Curiously, it's worked out that, even like major sports teams have contacted me in the U.S. here to consult with them on consciousness science so that they can theoretically get an edge in their sports activities. I won't go into who or anything.
No, but it's the future. I agree with you.
Correct.
So, yeah.
Correct. And it's actually a future by way of a return to the past.
Yeah, that's true.
So in that experience in Germany, there were the thing to note in seeing that museum was that there was a femur bone that was easily obviously human, and it would have made that human be about 11 or 12 feet high.
Wow.
And it was exhibited.
So giants in Antarctica.
Yeah, and it would say, yeah, exactly. And it was said in German, the little tag to it said bones of the giants found in Antarctica.
Yeah.
And then there's a little discussion about how they found huge amounts of bones and even graveyards, not just cataclysmic, all crushed together kind of bones, right? But systematically buried individuals that apparently had femurs that were 4 and 5 feet long, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I was quite intrigued. And then, of course, you ask the teachers about it, and they say, basically horse shit. Yeah. And then you're saying, but it's right over there. And then within that first year, a lot of strange things occurred, okay? Mm-hmm. And one of them was that these museums were stripped of all of that. Mm-hmm. Another thing that occurred that I was aware of was that all of these Nazi literature that was related to this guy that we called Colonel Dr. Herr Kamel. His name was Kammer, I think. He was a Africa Corps.
Hans Kammler?
Correct.
Yeah.
He was the head of the Africa Corps at the time, right? And where I was, they had a cache of books that he had or that had been prepared at his direction, and were all stamped with the Africa Corps symbol of the palm trees behind the camel. And that's why my brother and I called him Colonel Herr Dr. Camel, because they were all addressed to him. And these crates had all been prepared by the German military that were housing books that were just truly marvelous books, in our opinion. Mm. Now, the circumstances that we saw the books are neither here nor there, but some of the books were Mayan that had 5 or 6 languages that had been translated into 5 or 6 languages. So you'd see a leaf from a book that was Mayan glyphs, and then you'd see a translation into Hebrew, and then you'd see a translation into English, and then a translation into German. And of course, I couldn't read the Hebrew or the German at the time, so I would read the English. And you got the impression of that these were a systematic effort to hunt for something the way that today I would hunt for it with databases, and that they were attempting to ascertain something, all of this stuff going to basically prehistory, consciousness science, and Antarctica.
Mm. And isn't it interesting that before the Nazis explored that area, when they decided to do this, and I have Joseph Farrell has elaborated a little on this, they contacted Byrd because he was, the renowned Antarctica expert back then, and they knew obviously about his claims about hot zones and pristine areas undiscovered. So what did he, I bet he regretted later when
the participation.
It became a conflict, right?
Right.
But the interesting thing is that who sponsored this? Well, it was Hess and Goering. Hess was raised in Alexandria. He was familiar with esoteric lore. He was probably one of the much more occult than Himmler was a non-entity. He wasn't deep at all. Yeah, he was obsessed by these things. But Hess had a much more proper understanding than Himmler about these things. And so that Hess wants to send down expeditions down there smacks of everything we've been talking about, antediluvian mythology, Atlantis, whatever, right? But that Goering is sponsoring this. That's a practical man like Goering.
I know, that's a staggering. That's your engineers.
Right. And that's military.
That's
technology.
Correct. I was just going to say, that's the army, that's the Prussian army, that was the core of the their grasping for technology. And that's really all of the stuff that my brother and I were reading out of these books went to, was they were focused on that. There'd be vast areas that weren't translated, and then you'd see the areas that were translated, and it was all about machines and history and so on. Curiously, that was the first time I'd ever seen Ratzinger, who became Pope.
Right.
And he was at that point in the 60s. He was in some manner he was a German prelate, I guess you would say, or an officer of the church or whatever. And he came on over under these weird circumstances, and all these crates of books were sealed up by American GIs and put in the back of some trucks that were driven by German. And Ratzinger was the guy that was in charge of picking them all up.
There you go.
I observed this. I was up on the 3rd floor and watched this whole operation because I was scandalized that they were taking my books away.
But that goes in line with Ratzinger's new line of profession, because if there's anyone who's famous for stealing and monopolizing and putting covert ancient information, it's the Vatican, right? So he was consistent in his choice of career. I have to give him that. And by the way, I want to make a shout out right now for the next recording we're going to do, which will be with Joseph Farrell, and it will actually concern both Antarctica but also Hess and Goering. Those two people, as different as they were, as different factions as they were heading, had a common interest that was so deep that they may actually have tried to overthrow Hitler. But that's another story with another guest. But since we're touching it now, I'm advertising it, because this show will come out before that. So that's one to watch, people, if you think this is an interesting part of history. But we have to move on. There's so much material we have to go through. Anything else you want to mention about your Germany experience connected to Antarctica?
No, nothing that's particularly pertinent now. And then we come later on to my later in life mucking about with the data. And as I said, in 1997, one of the first anomalous sets I got, and the largest outside of the one for the sun, was about Antarctica. And of course, I was quite intrigued, and so Universe obviously wanted me to pursue it because I had the particular inclination, and perhaps I will bring something to it that others won't, for its purposes, not ours. We can never determine that ourselves. But in any event, so since then, I've been clued in, dialed into it, and have always watched the data sets as we've been going along. Right. And that led me up to the point of getting fantastic information out of my data sets and forecasts about Antarctica, some of which I was able to validate by going into current maps and kinds of things to get real world examples. And then recently, a couple of years back, I ran into the pollution into my data sets as a result of this religious cult of people that worship these blue space chickens, and their influence on the internet and their focus on Antarctica that got me into a circuitous loop.
You're talking about the Corey Good psyop?
Correct. Corey Good, the blue avians, Corey Good thing.
Are you taking that seriously?
Okay, so the thing about I'm not taking them seriously. What happened was that they have a fascination with Antarctica.
Yeah, no, but look, they steal everything that's pop.
Well, that was my point. That was my point, though, is they stole my stuff out of my written reports and fed it back in through their own audience. Their own audience is such within
They've done that with everyone. Farrell, you name it. That's what they do.
Right. But in this case, I wasn't prepared for it. I didn't know what was going on. This is my fault. I got screwed up. Had I known it was happening, I could have prevented the data pollution, but it got into a circuitous loop. And we have to understand, I tune my lexicon constantly. So I was tuning my lexicon to their pollution of my data, which threw that whole thing off. But prior to that, I had some really good information about Antarctica that they were stealing and piggybacking on for their own purposes. And see, I'm working in my bubble, and I didn't even know these guys existed. Right. And when I did see that they existed, I was just irritated at their use of the word ascension relative to densities and never saw beyond that.
Right. Well, you have the floor today, so you can elaborate on your version. I have plenty of time, so we can make a part 3 here, because episode part 2 is almost done, so we have to take a break in about 15 minutes. Sure. And if you have more juice in you, we'll take another part there. I have plenty of time, but I want to recap just for the benefit of order and the poor audience that may have fallen off the trail here, because we have because it's all building up to a crescendo for the end, and so don't worry, you can just ramble on. I'm keeping track here, and I'm keeping notes.
Okay, good deal.
So there's going to be some order out of this, but I want to recap, and that is that first we have the weird ancient stuff, right? Whatever that's worth. Then we know that, let's start with Bird then. we know that Byrd discovered something. I don't buy into those diaries. I think they are fakes, but that doesn't take anything away from the mystery, because even without those diaries, we have accounts that there's something extraordinary. Then we have at least the Nazis, if not people before them, but at least the Nazis, something going on there. What did they find? Why did they become obsessed? Because militarily speaking, it would be more sense that they made, which they did, lots of caves in Greenland and stuff like that. But why build all these bases at the end of the world, right?
Right.
So that's
and then we pick it up. Yep. As the USA instantly.
Well, the Russians in the 60s is the next step, I'm guessing.
I would say the U.S. in the 1948-49, right after the disastrous Operation High Jump.
Yeah, let's go a little into that. Yeah.
Yeah, so just temporally, Operation High Jump occurs. There's some major battle. We lose all kinds of personnel and resources in a mysterious fashion. A few lines in a Patagonian newspaper reference flying saucers and this sort of thing, and then everything basically goes dark. And at that point, we start seeing that Antarctica is given a different presence in the League of Nations, UN kind of thing.
Yeah. That's when they suddenly come together to make no zone.
Correct. Correct. And of course, this is 1947, the crash of the ships in the Arizona area, the whole
CIA is established.
Correct. All of these interesting things occur. And then also at that point, when this occurred, the United States military, the Army, more than the Navy or anything, but the Army went back to Antarctica in 1948 and 49, in spite of what had happened with Byrd. So whatever that occurred in the Operation High Jump was apparently no longer a threat in 48 and 49. And then throughout the early 50s is when they get up to the point where they're starting to include the idea of bringing in this nuclear power plant and establishing permanent bases and these sort of things within an Army paradigm. And then that goes black. Now, curiously about this, I was able to get hold of a copy of the 1956 Federal Register that was a printed version. And this was a number of years back. And within that version were a number of contracts being let for technology that I basically was able to, or that I assumed that my conclusion was, we've crossed, as of 1956, we've crossed the threshold of exploration of this alien technology to exploitation of it.
Why are you saying alien technology?
Because of the from 1947 through to 56 is the Federal Register, which is this document of contracts let by Congress. They used to, right up to the point of the Black Ops, would include everything.
But when you say alien, you mean like it's strange to us? That's what you mean?
Or? No. Like they actually used that term. They used alien, but they meant foreign. Okay.
Right. It doesn't have to mean little green man from Mars, right?
Correct. We have to watch language here, because in the late 40s, the idea alien and foreign were 100% interchangeable, and it wasn't until 47 in the crash of those ships that we started seeing the separation of the language and the tonality change for the word alien as opposed to its earlier meanings. Language changes over time. So there's all of these ambiguities that get into it. You got to be careful about it.
And they're so important. So yeah.
Correct. And in 1956, in that exploitation phase, there were contracts being let in 1956 for companies that we would know, JPL kind of things, Lockheed Martin and this sort of thing. There were contracts.
They were at it already then.
There were active contracts for Antarctica, and they were exploitation contracts, not a contract to go on out and map or explore this area, but rather contracts that were involving the moving of people and materiel to the various different parts of Antarctica for specific, although unnamed, purposes.
Wow.
So we were exploiting something. And that was the first real ramp up was in 56. And then that manifested in the big surge of military personnel, which to date, we still don't know how many that was, in 1958. And since 1958.
Oh, hang on. I have to interject.
Sure.
In 58 and 59, something weird happened. The alleged enemies, Soviet and US and England, and I think maybe also France, came together and they blasted nuclear weapons in Antarctica. Now, because of the signature, there's only two possibilities. One is that they did it high up in the atmosphere. Can you spell flying saucers?
Right.
The other is that it could have happened deep underground or underneath. That's as far as I understand.
That seems unlikely. I say that seems unlikely.
Well, can you spell Hollow Earth?
Yeah, perhaps, perhaps. But here's another thing about that. In 58 was when we first get, and this was my point of bringing this up, when the U.S. military moved in en masse in 1958, and however big that mass was, we don't know, but it's of course certainly dwarfed by current population. But when they first started doing that, that's when we got enough personnel there that we had enough overflight capability, continuous airplanes being on site on Antarctica that were used as local transportation, that we started replicating some of the things that were mentioned by Byrd in his flight logs about weird effects on machinery over certain parts of the Antarctic continent, usually within East Antarctica as opposed to West Antarctica, although you also see them in some minor degree in Western Antarctica.
Would East be Vostok area?
Correct. That's and then all the way up into the German area and all the way back down to McMurdo Bay and all of that. That's all on East Antarctica, and it's there that we see that Byrd reports all these strange characteristics trying to fly around. And but what's curious is that in the documents released in 59 or 60, I can't remember which year, was a discussion about a contract being let to map flight irregular zones. Okay, and these flight irregular zones ended up being no-fly zones later on. And the flight irregular zone was characterized by engines cutting out, communications going black, airplanes, drifting down out of the sky, that sort of thing. And so we had enough activity going.
Bermuda Triangle.
Correct. we had enough, or, magnetic effects, but they weren't magnetic because it didn't intrude on compasses or any of this sort of thing. Right. Everything just shut down. So, but we started.
No, but it's a matter of fact, in case people in the audience don't know it, it's a matter of fact that to date, no commercial planes are flying over the pole, neither north nor south. The poles are completely off limit.
Correct.
And of course, it's also logical because you can't use any. I think only a gyroscope is what you can use to really orientate yourself with at the poles, because they are dependent on being able to measure magnetism and stuff, and that completely breaks down at the poles. So they have that excuse, obviously, but we can't even go there physically, and I'm going to later tell you a couple of anecdotes from people I know and what's happened to them down there. But go on. Just wanted to interject.
Yeah,
that.
So in any event, I was going to say from that point on, Antarctica is only and always referenced as basically being a cruise or a sea destination. In other words, you don't fly to Antarctica to get on a cruise boat. You go to New Zealand to get on a cruise boat,
right,
or
right.
you would go in some other landmass, and so nobody is flying down there. And there's probably a really good reason as to why that's going on. But in any event, so
don't you think the military is flying there?
That's the curious part of it all, okay? Because the military has certain restrictions on flying there, even to this date. The reason that I know this is because I'm in the Pacific Northwest, and as screwy as it sounds, the military base up here, the Air Force Base, McChord, at the local joint military base, Fort Lewis McChord. McChord is or used to be the major staging area for U.S. military flights down to Antarctica. And we would see C-130s, big giant cargo planes, very heavily loaded, that just, listening to them fly over your house, you just know they're going to crash. You just know they're too heavy to make it. But they've got so much fuel and material and stuff when they take off that they groan getting up into the sky and things, right? And this went on for a number of years, and we would just notice, oh, hey, it's, Antarctica season, here they go. And for weeks at a time, you'd have these very large airplanes that would take off and head down there. They're not doing that so much anymore. But like in the last...
So when was this about, approximately?
This would have been through all through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and just into the 2000s a little bit. Maybe 2005 or 6, there was a big year, and then since then we haven't had much activity.
That's terribly interesting because something happened in 2011 I'm going to tell you about in the next part. So there were actually we can take it now maybe.
Sure.
You see, there's this explorer. He's like a kind of a macho man. He's called Jarle Andøy. And he had a boat called Berserk, and they were like sailing all over the world, especially the poles. And he's like a renegade, like a rebel, an anarchist almost. So he didn't care if the Norwegian government didn't give him permission to go down there. He went anyway.
Good for him.
Yeah, and people think it's like easy to go there. People try to debunk stuff. We've talked about this before. Oh, no, it's so, no, everybody can. Oh, there's cruise. No, you can't. People have no idea what terrible bureaucracy it is to even get permission to even sail in the area. If you're just an ordinary person, if it's not good commercial or military reasons,
For science?
good luck. Try it. Good luck. You won't get it.
You just won't get it.
Nope. So it's not just that they censor everything and
Safety concerns, but you just don't get permission to do it.
safety, right? But everywhere else that's dangerous. Go ahead. So no, but they did it, and something happened, and I'm not at liberty to say everything I've been told by one of the surviving crew members that I incidentally know because he's from my town.
Right.
But what you can read about in the news is that these very experienced sailors who's been there many times were docking. I wonder if it was in the Ross Sea, but they were docking the boat, and then they sent 3 of the guys inland. I forgot what they were going to do, but while they were inland, there were a few people back in the boat. Their storm broke loose, and they lost contact with each other, the boat and the crew inland. And if you ask me, I would rather be in a boat, safe and sound, with coffee and heat and anchor, right, in a storm,
Right.
than being a poor fellow out in the ice. So they were setting up tent, and they are Vikings. They survived, and when they came back to the boat, it was gone. What was left? They found some traces here and there. Now I have to be careful what I say, but the thing is, the official story is that the boat went under in the storm. It has to be a hell of a storm for a boat who's sailing all over the world, who's anchoring. At least if it's that bad, they could have tried to flee like those who were on foot. But those on foot were much worse, obviously. They were in tents,
Right.
and they survived.
Right.
And the Norwegian government tried to crush them instead of helping them, instead of offering them, what would happen anywhere else in the world. They had to finance their own expeditions to try to find, and they found remnants, and from what they found, it seems that the boat was bombed.
Oh.
It was destroyed. And these guys aren't woo-woo guys at all. I doubt they even know what a UFO is. Okay.
Right.
So, well, I'm putting it, that's rhetorical. But the thing is, this is in February 2011. And you're saying it's not ordinary even for the military to fly around there. So who shot asunder their boat? Who killed? Why were they killed? Were they witness to something they shouldn't be witness to? This is the mystery, right?
Yeah.
I can't say so much. I even went too far with what I said now. So, and that's because I promised that guy, right? It's not because I'm a shill or I don't want...
Sure. I have that same situation. I've got a promise I made to a guy who was in Catalonia who sent me some photographs of pyramids in Antarctica that he had personally taken, and he said I can reveal who he is in the photographs when I hear of his death, and he's got someone who will let me know when that occurs. And prior to that time, it was just for my information so the two of us could discuss it. There are some things I can say in a general way as to how it occurred to him that he got these photos and what was going on.
Wow.
And it also speaks to the weirdness that is Antarctica, because this guy he was given permission to go hiking, to do an exploratory hike. It was very rare. He was with a group. They were going to go, they're climbers. This was a group of very experienced mountain climbers.
When was this?
I got to be real careful there because that betrays too much. Okay, but let's just say that it was
80s, 90s.
Correct. I was just going to say, let's just restrict it to a broad area in the late 80s and into the 90s. All right.
Okay.
And so he gets permission to go down with a group of people. He is in Catalonia. He's not Catalonian. We won't go into any of their nationalities or anything, but this group of people were given permission to go into the British zone because they wanted to try climbing in some mountains that the British had titular control of. And they go and they do the climb, and he said it was in their climb and they were all fitted with these very cumbersome, big, bulky things that they had to haul with them, which they were told were for their own safety and security. And these were like EPIRBs, like personal location beacons. And they were just clunky, and the guy resented having this thing slapping on his back as he's trying to climb these very icy, precipitous routes. But they found two things that were really interesting to him. The routes were easy. They'd been climbed many times before, and he said, as a climber, he said he saw climbers' marks all over every single place they had to make a decision as to which way to go. And climbers have a particular iconographic approach to leaving marks for each other and for themselves. As I turned here, in order to get back, I got to go back this way, that kind of thing. But they don't do it in language. They do it in particular marks chopped into the ice or under the rock. Here they found climbers' marks etched into rock that was under ice. And so the climbers had obviously been climbing before the ice had been taken over that area, and they actually chipped through some ice to make some marks on rocks, only to discover the rock was just filled with such marks. Wow. And then they come out of this valley, or come out of this crevasse, this pass, if you will, a naturally occurring trail, a kind of a single wide kind of a trail. And he said that as each of these individuals came out, they were staggered because there across this little plain in front of them were three giant pyramids, one of which had a entrance level or a doorway that had an arch above it. And that doorway is probably 30 or 40 meters tall and might be 20 meters wide, and is about a third of the way up the pyramid. And down below it are giant stairs that they could, when they got to that area, they could reach the top of the stairs with their ice axe. So it was the stairs were probably about 11 feet high, the rise on the stairs. And they were able to do some level of climbing before they were snatched out. Now, here's the deal. The interesting part of this is not what they saw, the pyramids and so forth, but the fact that as soon as it became known through these location beacons that these people had wandered off of the area they were supposed to be and had gotten up into this pass and then down into this valley, he said their beacons started going off. The little red things were flashing like mad. None of the individuals had pulled the trigger, the emergency locator thing. And he said within a half an hour to 40 minutes, there were helicopters coming in to get them. And it was not British people in helicopters. It was Americans in very heavily altered Huey kind of helicopters, and that were able to fly in that particular region. It's difficult for helicopters to fly in the cold under any circumstances, but they didn't even know helicopters were available on the entire continent of Antarctica. And here were three of them that came plowing over the top of this hill. And then there was this guy who shouted at him in English through a loudspeaker system to get away, to stand over in this area and not to move, or they would be shot. And and so they did as they were told. They were scooped up and quickly hustled out of Antarctica. He said there was not an extra minute wasted in stripping them of everything. He was fortunate enough to, as he told me, when they said that they were going to shoot him, he said he thought about swallowing his film canister and did not do that, but instead tore the finger off of a glove, took the film out of the camera, because we're talking 35 millimeter film itself, put it in the finger of the glove, and then secreted the finger of the glove in his shorts near his groin. And that was the only way that he got out, because they were stripped down to their underwear, given new clothes, put on another helicopter at this base, taken back to their embarkation point, and hustled the hell out of the Antarctic area. And they were not allowed to talk to each other. They were always kept separate after the helicopters picked them up.
So the pictures survived?
Yes. And I have some copies of the pictures, like run through a Xerox machine.
Are these the pictures that are all over the internet?
No, mine. I've never I've never seen the ones I have, and I've never released the ones I've had.
But is it the same pyramids?
No. But it's very similar. I mean, it's hard to say one pyramid from another, but I don't believe they're the same. No.
That's so interesting for so many reasons. I had pyramids on the top of my list of where we were going next. That connects the ancient with the modern. But you got there. But now I was thinking of taking a break, but I'll give people a very hot bone before we take that break. And that is, this may be the same expedition actually.
Oh, geez.
But anyway, there was an expedition. Another Norwegian. This was a woman. She's been many times at the pole. She's like this super Viking woman, a scientist. Her name is Monica Christensen. People can Google her. Now, what I'm going to say now is partly speculation, but it's inferred from facts, because I was following it back in the day. In December 1993, they were taking like not a real pole, because for a Norwegian to go on a real polar expedition, you basically have to use ski and dogs, right?
Right.
These are professionals. They've done it many times before. This time they had snowmobile, and they were, and I think they were I think they at least had a German with them, so not just Norwegians. Here's the weird thing. I remember it from the even back then. This was before internet and all that, but still it was weird stuff. And the papers weren't that censored back then. So what happened is that this was going to be a symbolic mission for the Norwegian Olympic events that were going to happen in 94, the year after. So it was connected to that. It was like a PR stunt, whatever. So I think they were going to find traces of Amundsen or something. It was going to be like a run-of-the-mill thing.
Yeah.
So what happens is that a huge tragedy. We get reports that one of the people in the mission is dead. And she's in tears. She's she's seen a ghost. After that, she stopped everything to do with pole, and she got a completely different line of business. Now, what had happened, according to the official story, is that they had. Is it called a lavine, like a hole? And yeah. So these professionals, this guy who died, had fallen down in a lavine, and they had Americans. They had a search and rescue mission from Americans. That smells fishy. So they had come with choppers and everything, and the Americans threatened to sue her if she spoke about that, and they too had gone astray, allegedly by mistake. These professional people who knows what they're doing, had gone where they weren't supposed to go. And so what's interesting about these things is that both in Jarle Andøy and in Monica Christensen's case, what makes me extremely suspicious is the aftermath. Both of them are getting into all sorts of legal trouble.
Right.
Both of them are threatened with lawsuits. In Jarle's case, because he's a rebel, he didn't comply. He got fined. He lost people in his expedition, and he gets court cases. It's still going on, I think. And they tried to bankrupt him, and and she got threatened with this. And both of them sued if they talk. Actually, Jarle was sued and blamed. He was first threatened. If he didn't comply, they were going to punish him, which they did. So they bogged him down in economic mess because he talked too much. And she was terrified when she came back. In fact, she wasn't allowed to talk, so it was just a press release that they wrote. She didn't even control that. And why are the Americans suing? And why are the Americans threatening to ruin them economically? The Americans, jeez. So it's not just fishy, it smells rotten fish. What are they so afraid of?
Yeah.
Why would you treat people in a tragedy like this, right? And what the heck does the American helicopters, search and rescue mission? Doesn't sound like nerdy scientist in McMurdo to me. Sounds like military.
Correct. Yeah.
In fact, if I recall right, it may have been military. So this was in December 93.
Well, you have to get military permission to go there.
Pardon?
I say even today, for even on cruises here, If I were to apply to go to, if I wanted to get on a cruise to go to Antarctica, I don't just buy a ticket.
No.
I do have to buy a ticket to get to the boat and so forth. But as soon as I buy the ticket for the boat, my credentials have to be, you have to fill out this form, and it is actually passed through the Department of Defense, goes through the Pentagon to see if I'll actually get permission or not to go there. So even now.
But she had permission.
Right.
Monica Christensen was an official expedition team because I bet they're thinking, oh, these naive, bothersome Norwegians, they're always going to walk on the poles, right? So if it's official, we've done it for centuries. So if it's official, they kind of have to go along. But it's pretty restricted. I had a teacher who used to, that's when I first got interested in Antarctica. This was in children's school, which is a primary school.
Sure.
Not gymnas, but below gymnas. So he was one of the official scientists who worked in the base there, and he told me that he used to have like these pictures on a screen projector, right? And he talked about Antarctica. But he was a scientist, a nerd, so it wasn't anything interesting beyond geography and geology and stuff like that. But I remember he told me that they had to oh no, that wasn't allowed. No, you couldn't do this. Everything had to be cleared in a huge bureaucracy, international bureaucracy, where I'm pretty sure Pentagon is at the top of the decision chain.
I would agree, yes. And it's weird, I mean, it's irritating.
It is. And my point is, when you see the context of these anecdotes, I mean, yours were downright, you have hardcore evidence. But the way I presented, granted that everything I said now is accurate about the two other missions, don't you agree it smells?
Oh, certainly. Oh, yeah. They are certainly covering up something. And I think it now is just, yet another front on the great consciousness war. Because think of how the consciousness of humans would change if we knew where we come from and what our real history was like. And I actually think that's what's going on in Antarctica is they've found...
Oh, don't spill the bean.
Okay.
Don't spill the bean.
Okay.
We're going to go straight to the answers in part 3.
Sure,
so stay tuned, people. You don't want to miss this.
All of our files are free and will remain free. If you like the show, you can show support by donating $1 to help with expenses. Just use the PayPal link on our website, YouTube channel, or Facebook page. Thanks.